Nadeem said, if we can just get everybody to mute themselves if you're not speaking. I will now officially welcome you to the session, and on behalf of NDU Lawyers, I'd like to welcome you to today's session on transparency as a catalyst for elite sporting success as part of SIGA Week 2023. Firstly, I'd like to thank Dr. Nadeem Nassif for inviting me to moderate this important session today. This session is based on the book that he co-authored and published by Palgrave Macmillan. Congratulations. The book is titled National Success in Elite Sport, Exploring the Factors That Lead to Success. I would now like to introduce myself as the moderator and then our esteemed panelists for today. I am Dr. Camilla Swart. I'm the Program Director for the Masters of Sport and Entertainment Management in the College of Science and Engineering at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Our program is a joint degree with the University of South Carolina. Our star of the show today, Dr. Nadeem Nassif, Associate Professor in Physical Education and Sports, the Department of Psychology, Education and Physical Education at NDU Lawyers, Lebanon. Then we have joining us from Australia, Dr. Michael Lindley, Senior Research Fellow, Institute of Health and Sport, Victoria University. And then all the way down south in Cape Town, Professor Simeon Davies, Head of Department of Sports Management at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology in South Africa. So welcome everybody. As we said, this session is related to elite sporting success and transparency. But to start with us, I'd like to give Nadeem the opportunity to share with us his inspiration for the book and the development of the world ranking of countries in elite sport. If you can just give us a brief overview of why this book and what it entails.
Okay, thank you first of all, Dr. Camilla, for introducing me. Thank you everyone. Hi everyone. So actually it all started with the creation of the ranking. The ranking was created because I believed that the Olympic medal table had many loopholes. It did not give an accurate measurement of countries' performance in sport. Very few countries are ranked in the medal table. 46% if we take the last Winter and Summer Olympics, only 94 countries. It's not enough. The ranking is very inaccurate. It doesn't weight the different sports. Some sports are very popular and universal. It's much more competitive than other sports. So this is why we wanted to. It started first with the creation of the ranking. Once we were able to rank all the countries in all the sports, it opened the door for holistic comparison, holistic analysis. We could see what are the factors that are behind country success in sport. So we did correlation between sport success and population, which is the low correlation, by the way, less than 0.4. Sport success and wealth with GDP, it was a strong correlation above 0.7, and correlation between sport and research output, which was almost 0.8. So we could identify the factors, the general factors that are behind country success in sport, and this is what led me to start this book. And I was helped by my former PhD supervisor, who is a mentor to me, Professor Michel Raspeau, who was the second author, who helped me organize my thought and my ideas, and who wrote the part related to the cultural factors. So that's it.
Thank you, Nadeem, for giving us a broad overview of what the book entailed and the factors and why you undertook this journey. I know you've highlighted that population and GDP per capita are of significant importance, and that there are other determining factors impacting countries' elite sporting success. such as wealth, scientific knowledge, genetics, geography, cultural and political interests. So I'm going to turn over to our panelists. Firstly, Michael, if you would like to share your views based on your experiences in Australia, and then followed by that, Simeon can talk to some of his experiences in South Africa, and or more generally on Nadim's view on this, on his findings.
Thank you very much, Professor Swart, and for Nadim for the opportunity to join you, and welcome everybody to this session. I think what's remarkable is the opportunity to unpack some of the myths around sport performance in a way that hasn't been done before, which is what Dr. Nassif has managed to do. I think one of the things that really has sort of jumps out is the fact that when we talk about punching above our weight, one of the things, once you factor in the wealth of the nation and the financial support that goes into that, it starts to look at a different lens on what punching above your weight really looks like. And that's certainly true in Australia. So Australia is probably more well-known for, one of the things it's well-known for is its Australian Institute of Sport. That was established on the back of a fairly poor performance in Australia from the Montreal Olympic Games. And for a time, it certainly pushed the sport forward. What's come to light since then, and there's been two really significant shifts. One is the ongoing funding of sport and the need for that to continue. That's been highlighted in Dr. Nassif's work, as well as in the SPLIS model. It's foundationally is how much is being invested in the sport and how much does that is that ongoing, particularly where it is linked back to performance. So it's performance-based funding, which drives, of course, a heightened work towards high performance outcomes because it requires you to deliver in order to sustain that funding. The second part of that has actually been the Wood Review, which was undertaken in 2017, results published in 2018. That looked at two particular aspects of sport. It's been the outcome of that's been expanded since now. And the first one was the impact of wagering, gambling, and on the transparency of the sport that we're watching and how critical that is. So on one hand, we need transparency around the funding that goes to sport, but we also need incredible transparency around, are we watching is a fair competition, or is it being compromised in some way, either by doping, which is one half of the review, and the other half is around wagering and the value of sport. As the commercial value of sport has risen, so has the opportunity to make money from that, which has driven negative actors into the market to try and influence those outcomes. Where Australia has been able to set up the Sports Integrity Australia. It's an institute, it's an agency delivered specifically around the cleanness of sport, and its remit is to maintain that around wagering, around safeguarding the integrity of sport. And that's fundamental. So highlighting, I think, as Dr. Nassif has done, the importance of fundamental wealth of the nation, and therefore how much of that wealth is also directed towards the sports. Second part is transparency of whether that actually ends up at the sport, or is it siphoned off, or is it, let's say, corrupt practices means that not all actually gets to the athletes, because that's where it actually happens. And the third part of that is making sure that doping, wagering, and also protection of children, as we think about grassroots programs, we need to make sure that those aspects of the sport are also clean and well defined. I think that perhaps to sum that up, when we think about the funding of sport, where we think the conditions of investment in sport in Australia from the Sports Commission is that the NSOs, the National Sports Organisations, earn the right for support. It's not ultimately given, they earn it, and that's about accountability and outcomes. podium potential, so it is around elite sport, as well as the athlete development, their well-being and their engagement. So it's making that transparency around the investment framework. And NSOs have to earn the right. It's not just a given. So there's both. There is the opportunity from high investment in sport or solid investment in sport, as well as accountability for that funding. And that can be traceable all the way through the system.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing those valuable insights. I think Michael's actually taken us into the next part of the conversation in terms of transparency, but I think it also, he highlights how sporting success has evolved and developed, you know, right off the back of the performance way back in 1976, and you see all these developments in Australia, which we will come back to in a while. I just want to give Simeon a chance to reflect on these factors from a South African and a context, if he's able to join us. It seems he's having some challenges. Simeon, are you there?
Hi, Camilla. Can you hear me?
We can, but there's echoing. I don't know if anyone else is having the same type of echoing. You have two devices connected. I don't know if that's potentially why.
Hi, Camilla. It's echoing, yeah. I'm going to try and make a plan here. So, would you like to carry on the conversation? I apologise.
Yes, and as you join us, we'll pick it up again. Okay, so Nadeem, as I mentioned, Michael has spoken a little bit about, you know, what's been happening in Australia around transparency and accountability, but you've highlighted in the book, especially in terms of the cultural and political interest in relation to the National Olympic Committees and the National Sports Federations in particular. So in your view and based on your research, how does transparency relate to elite sporting success?
You know, the book has identified in the end a framework that leads to success. It's called GIFT, GGIFTE. You have geography, genetics, interest of the different stakeholders, public actors, private sector, the people, citizens. When you volunteer for sport, indirectly you're funding the system. And then you have F, which is funding, that is highly dependent on wealth. Then you have T, which is transparency. And then you have E, which is expertise. So it's a chain that leads to success. So transparency is in the end, almost in the end of the chain. So if you have good transparency, as Michael said, it will allow to the funding to go and to allow to the expert to implement the proper policies for success. Coaches, managers, all the stakeholders that are involved at a micro and meso level will be able to work properly. So transparency, if there is a lack of transparency, funding will not reach the place that it should reach. People will be appointed in certain position according to perhaps a political belonging, not to their competences. And unfortunately, and this was part of my PhD, and I published on that, it is the case many times of what's happening in Lebanon. The lack of transparency did not allow proper funding to the sport structure. You had this financial corruption, and you also had an administrative corruption where some people were put in a certain position according to their political allegiance, not to their competences in sport. So this is from where I come from. in my view. I think it's the lack of transparency affecting elite sport results happens many places around the world, but because I did my PhD in Lebanon, on sport in Lebanon, and because I am an actor of Lebanese, I mean, I for Lebanese sport, it was an easy experience to relate to.
Okay, thank you for that. I think Simeon may be able to join us now, so I'll just direct it again to Simeon. If you mentioned it was a Lebanese case, but it's in other parts of the world, and of course in South Africa, it's no different. We've had challenges in terms of our National Olympic Committee in particular, where we've also seen issues around where funding from the private sector has been withdrawn because of a lack of good governance. So maybe, Simeon, you want to touch both upon in terms of some of the factors impacting countries' elite success, and then we'll pick up on specifically in relation to transparency as well.
Thanks, Camilla. And just like to, can you hear me, Camilla?
Wonderful, no echo.
Wonderful. We have some power, I think. I'd just like to thank Nadine for a really excellent exposition on perhaps a new framework for looking at how elite sport is achieved, on a sort of framework which makes a lot more sense to me than some of the other frameworks. I thought that what I would perhaps focus on is the issue of gender. And obviously, when we look at sport, we tend to look at things in a sort of through a certain lens. And I think, Michael, you would be fully aware you've just had the Women's FIFA World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. And one of the interesting anomalies which has happened, which is pertinent to South Africa, was the success of the South African women's football team. There is no professional league in South Africa. Women's sport is not supported at all well, and the female team, or the women's team, not only did they win the African Cup of Nations to qualify for the World Cup, but they actually got through to the knockout rounds, beating teams like Italy to achieve that success. And I suspect what's going to happen, Professor Nassif, is that your model is going to get more and more sophisticated as one starts to try and factor in issues around not only genetics and politics, but also issues around gender and ways in which countries approach this. The other thing I think I'd just like to pick up on in terms of transparency is the fact that there is a huge discrepancy or disassociation with the revenues generated by FIFA for this particular Women's Football World Cup and what those women were accruing in terms of benefits, financial benefits. And I think that sort of, it's like a drip feed all the way from the top down to the national federations in terms of the sort of unfairness which comes into play in sport generally. I just to reiterate, I really like the association between GDP and research, because I think it doesn't matter which area you're in, whether it's sport or in science or whatever it might be, the output of research is well correlated to the GDP of the country and the investment into universities, and if you take my meaning, also by association into sport teams. So I think what you've done here is you've opened up if you like, a wonderful opportunity for policymakers and private and public sector organisations, governments as well, to structure their approach to sport in a much more effective, open way, so we have a better idea of what's going on. So I've kind of focused on the gender issue a little bit. I hope that's okay with you. But I just think given that we've just had the Women's Football World Cup, it's probably a pertinent point to sort of throw into the conversation. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you, Simeon. Absolutely pertinent. I was getting to Australia, the World Cup, and the links to South Africa and the women's team, but you've already foregrounded that, so thank you. Before we get back to that, or maybe Michael wants to build on that, but Michael, in his introductory note, did talk about certain initiatives that Australia has taken to enhance good governance and integrity in sport. And I maybe you can just elaborate that on a little bit more, Michael, in terms of the role of good governance in sporting success. And if you want to pick up again on the stellar performance of the Australia, not just in terms of the performance, the hosting of the games, which is also an important aspect raised in Nadim's book of the hosting of international major events and the correlation with elite sporting success, but also in terms of the fantastic performance of the home team. And then I'm going to say more broadly, you could also see, as Simeon mentioned, South Africa, but other smaller teams as well in terms of the success. So what does this say for this conversation around transparency and elite sporting success?
There we are. That's better. Thank you. Look, I think that's a really good sort of pathway to sort of just tap on a few key points that Simeon has raised around the women's game in particular. And I'll probably start. Sport Integrity Australia is a relatively new agency, and initially it was founded off the back of the Wood Review, and it was to look at those two aspects around transparency in terms of wagering and the commercialization of sport and doping. More recently, and particularly in the last 18 months, there's been a lot more around protection of the athletes, so the well-being and welfare of the athletes, particularly the protection of young athletes, and we've seen that through the disgraceful, but I mean, I guess only that it's come to light is good, around the predatory nature of some coaches around particularly girls and the young girls, and the need. So Sport Integrity Australia has now taken under its remit. Part of that is to also look at protection of women, of athletes, and the ability for them to have recourse to raise issues and to make sure that they are protected and looked after, which is fundamental to having a solid grassroots of women's sport coming through, that women don't walk away simply to protect themselves from those circumstances and that environment, that sport is a positive and safe environment for them to compete in. It's great that's happened. So what's happening now is Sport Integrity Australia are actually training integrity officers who are going to be funded by Sport Integrity Australia and placed into the NSOs. So we're no longer relying on the NSOs initially to even report those same issues. So they are actually placing them inside the NSOs to make sure that there is a direct line between the athletes, the sporting organisations, and the integrity unit charged with looking after it. So it's not actually coming into the NSO's budget. It is funded by Sport Integrity Australia. So there's no argument to say we can't afford you, or we shouldn't have you, or it should be a part-time role. It's like, we're trained up, we're in. I think that comes on really well on the back of the Women's World Cup, which has suddenly lifted women's sport. So Australia has had a very fortunate and talented group of cricketers that have come through and raised the profile of women's sport. And suddenly we've got on the other side, the football team, the Matildas, coming through, also testament to the sold out stadia and literally the largest television event in Australia in the last 20 years has been the Matildas in the World Cup. Ironically, the prior one to that was actually Kathy Freeman in the 2000 Olympic Games. So somehow women's sport seems to be underfunded and not treated as well, and yet the two highest rating events ever actually in the last 20 years have both been women's events. We'll unpack that another day. But I think the question on the back of this is, will that flow through? The commercial opportunities flow through to going back to seeding into that grassroots funding? And will it be evenly distributed? So there's a challenge, which is netball. The Women's Netball World Cup was on in Cape Town at the same time as the Women's Football World Cup. Australia won that tournament in Cape Town, and it was almost not seen in Australia because of the Women's World Cup. So there's a real challenge around, again, as in men's sport, in women's sport, there's a disparity between the largest of the events taking much more of the media and the commentary and the attention, even though there's extraordinarily good performances at all levels and across different sports. So the challenge is still to make sure that we have support across a range of sports, particularly somewhere that is heavily grassroots based like netball as well as football, and it doesn't just aggregate to only the biggest of the sports.
Thank you, Michael, for bringing us back to the netball and South Africa, because I was also going to pick that up with Simeon. But before we go to Simeon, and you just mentioned it now, I mean, netball, I think netball amongst girls in Australia has a much longer tradition than football. And I was also surprised to see that these two events were happening at the same time, and it just didn't seem like Australia, which has been a powerhouse of netball in the world, received the same amount of attention. And so it was also going to be my question to you in terms of, I mean, netball's not a minnow sport in Australia, in the Australian context. So now, how do they now compete with football?
It's a really good question. It's not a minnow sport from a participation point of view, but economically it really struggles. It really struggles. So we have a domestic professional league, which even 10 years ago didn't exist. But it struggles to get the viewership, and it struggles to get the attendance, and therefore commercial value is not there. So we have a disparity between the most popular and most broadly played women's sport in Australia, and yet commercially it's not there. So the only way for that to continue is through government providing sufficient funding based on its grassroots participation, not based on its commercial value. Whereas other sports perhaps can continue on a purely commercial basis. To the extent that that's transparent, it's transparent in the way that it's given, but again, netball is limited to almost Commonwealth nations too largely, and FIFA has a global audience. So we will it take away from the netball for girls to see the opportunity? Probably it will, but at the end of the day, I'd rather see more girls playing than not. So even if the balance isn't where it's been historically, that's something for netball to continue to find new ways to innovate and to find an economic model that works.
Thank you, Michael. Simeon, I'd like to bring you in at this point because besides the Netball World Cup that we've just hosted in Cape Town, the performance of Banyana, the South African national football team, we also hosted the Cricket World Cup earlier this year in Cape Town as well. So how do you see, in terms of adding to how we're going to, balance these different women's sports or encourage more sport amongst women, and at the same time address issues of commercialization and transparency in terms of elite sporting success for women in particular?
Thanks, Camilla. I suspect what we're getting into here is this inherent tension about profit-making organizations and competing in the marketplace. And it doesn't matter if you're FIFA or you're the Netball Association globally or any sport organization, you're actually competing in a market. And I think that's one of so we can talk about the importance of equity and transparency, but the problem with corporations as such, or profit-making organizations like FIFA, is their duty to their shareholders is to make a profit, and they will do that almost exclusively in many ways to perpetuate that. And as an aside, it's always interesting to look at the American setup of sport and how certain sports are so protected. The NFL is a franchise system controlled by the NFL. So what I think we need to be aware of is, as much as we would like to change the tapestry of sport, particularly elite sport in the world, I think we need to understand that some of the mechanisms at play in here are people who run profit-making organizations, and their job is to seek profits. And unfortunately, that can supersede any sort of more important social issues, which we as academics and people who are concerned about community issues try to put forward. So I put that out there because I think we need to be sometimes a little bit realistic. And it's incredibly frustrating when you see in the South African top context that the men's national team has done nothing since 1996, but they have a fully paid, fully sponsored professional football league, which attracts millions of supporters to watch really mediocre football, to be honest. Whereas the women's team plays some outstanding football, and they're essentially amateurs, and they're not supported. And I think somehow we've got to shift the marketplace and understand that, it's a difficult one. And I'm not sure if I've added to the conversation, but I do think Professor Nassif's approach to this gives us some ways of analysing things more objectively and allowing us to support what needs to happen in terms of growing the market in different ways. And coming back to the cricket, so cricket's a big thing, and we've had a number of these international competitions, netball, cricket in South Africa, and internally they were very, very popular. But it's very difficult from my point of view, my perspective, to assess the impact and the popularity of those events overseas. And Michael's just alluded to the fact that the Women's Netball World Cup, even though the national team won, the Australian national team, was not that well supported. So but this is why we're having this conversation, because it's about transparency, so we get to see what's actually going on and how we might be able to improve the global elite sports situation. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you, Samin. I think that those were valuable insights, and I think I want to turn to Nadeem now. Having the discussion was mainly around women's sport, but both Michael and Simeon have added contributions in terms of the marketplace and what's happening in other parts of the world, or how these sports organizations function in other parts of the world. I just, given the conversation we've had around this, maybe you want to reflect from your experience, both in terms of Lebanon and then in terms of you writing the book and how this fits in.
Well, comparing Lebanon to South Africa and Australia is pretty complicated. I mean, Australia is a global powerhouse in sport. They're top 5 in the world. South Africa is top 20. Lebanon didn't make it to the top 90. The best ranking we had since 2014 is 91. So it's very difficult to compare them. I think the kind of loopholes that can be found in Australia or in South Africa are different kind of loopholes that you can find in Lebanon. So if you want to compare the transparency issues that you can find in Australia and those that you can find in South Africa, they're different than those that are found in Lebanon. I think the lack of transparency that we have in Lebanon is mainly at the administrative level. We didn't even reach the execution level of the event, of organizing an event. Like you said that you were talking about hosting the Cricket World Cup. South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup in 1995. Australia has hosted so many events. So I think it's difficult to compare. I think the transparency issues are numerous. And Michael talked about doping. We can talk about embezzlement of funds. We have different problem of transparencies. And I think what could lead to a change or to improvement in transparency is a bottom-up and top-down approach. You need to implement strong rules, but you also need to educate the people that are at the micro level to have, let's say, transparent behavior, or to push toward good governance. It's a bottom-up and top-down approach. I don't know if I was able to summarize. Well, I mean, what you were expecting me to talk about.
That's good. I think you've led us into the sort of the last part of this conversation. You're talking about top down and bottoms up. Michael also mentioned, sort of sport integrity officers. You've mentioned, of course, the contexts are very different and different types of issues around transparency. So I'm going to hand over to Michael first, maybe just to provide some sort of final thoughts on given what we've shared and also the experiences of Australia, maybe some actionable steps that could be used to use transparency as a catalyst for elite sporting success.
Sure, thank you, Professor Swart. I think that where we are today is as Dr. Nassif has so elegantly put forward, is that the issues that we've got, we're all on a journey, and so Australia has had the benefit of starting this journey earlier. There is such a deep cultural association with sport that governments have felt it's been okay to fund it and felt supported to do so in terms of it's popular to fund sport, and that has led to continued interest and success. It has led to also the opportunity to invest in sport and sport infrastructure, which allows us then to host events, which allows our athletes to then compete in those events and build their world-class, gain that experience in world-class events. I think if there's a challenge ahead for Australia, it's probably twofold. One is that as we become more commercially bound, as Simeon has rightly raised, that we become much more, we see the privatization and commercialization of sport in so many levels, that there becomes an inherent interest in, if there's a problem, we no longer we push it away from being transparent because we don't want to jeopardize sponsorship and government funding and the sport going forward. So if you think about the fan base and the opportunity that, whether it's in cycling, where we had the doping scandal from Balco and Festina, and the pullback from sponsors from that, there can be a sort of a hidden tendency to be not just risk averse, but to actually hide away from facing up to challenges and transparency and risks, as we don't want to disrupt the economic and the market model that runs. The bigger that gets, the harder that is to continue to be open and transparent. And I think that's probably the challenge for Australia going forward. I think from a grassroots perspective, having every young athlete in whatever sport it is turning up and saying, I'm clean and it's a fair competition and that's what I want to compete in. I contribute to that and that's what I want to compete in. Building that as the grassroots ethos is probably our best protection going forward, that everybody feels like they've got a share in making sure that sport is fair and clean and transparent in the outcomes.
Thank you, Michael. Simeon, any final thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I think one of the things that might be coming through for me is, and I'll use this as an example because I think it's probably pertinent, but we know that Russia had a systemic drug abuse system with their athletes, and they've been effectively, as a nation state, excluded from participating as a nation state in competition because of that involvement by the government or the mechanisms of government. And I think that perhaps one of the ways we need to start looking at things, and a comparative model might be the way we look at carbon sequestration and the climate issues, about how we recognize countries who are trying to make a change and should be awarded accordingly. And I think that sort of example has some relevance to sport, in as much that countries or organizations that seek to be transparent, that seek to support from grassroots to the elite level, to support various parts of the community, men and women and other stakeholders, would meet criteria for competing in elite sport, because you need to have that ground base in order to go forwards. And countries that don't do that, and if you like, exclusively focus on one certain thing or a certain component of their population to the exclusion of others, may not be permitted. So to compete, say for example, in the FIFA World Cup or whatever it might be. So I think one of the things that might be to think about going forwards is the importance of transparency in terms of entering elite competition. If you run a big organization, you're subject to corporate law and fiduciary oversight, and if you don't do those things, you're not allowed to operate as a company. And I think that kind of oversight would be appropriate for sport, given its more professional context. So I hope that helps a little bit in terms of the conversation. I think it's quite a new conversation in the way this is going forwards, and I have to say it's very refreshing from my point of view. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Simeon. Nadeem, I see you're nodding in agreement. I'm going to give the final word to Hugh, and just again to say congratulations on the book. I think, as Simeon has indicated, has pushed us forward in terms of a new way of thinking about this. And I would like to just, from your perspective, where to from now, if you can give us some of your thoughts.
Okay, so thank you very much again for this very interesting panel. Thank you, Camilla, for moderating it. I mean, this book it's a result of a long research, 7 years. So it has passed a cap in terms of academic. I mean, it has passed a cap in academia. Now implementing it on the field is much more complicated. So where to go from here? We need to perhaps promote these ideas through conferences, through seminars with policymakers, because conferences are interesting, but if you don't push this through to policymakers, it will go nowhere. And we need to find a way to advocate these ideas without being too confrontational. Because usually when you deal with the policymakers, sometimes if you come and tell them that, okay, you tell them there is corruption here, perhaps you will have a confrontation with them, and it will not lead to a certain change. So research is something, applying it something else. We need to be sensitive on the realities of the field to be able to effect some changes.
Thank you, Nadeem. I think, yes, we always need to ground ourselves in reality, and implementation is always a little bit more challenging. But we need to push, and each one of us is a change agent. So once again, I'd like to thank you for firstly taking on this hugely important subject and pushing us in to think of it in a different way, that moves the conversation forward, but also makes meaningful change in relation to transparency and its role in the elite sporting success. So once again, congratulations and thank you to you, Dr. Nadeem. Thank you, Michael and Simeon, for your valuable contributions and insights. And I sincerely hope that we take this work forward and that the conversations continue to a point where we may have some actionable implementation activities as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you.